Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
Well, we're here today with Professor Gordon Wood, who is the Alva Oway Professor Emeritus at Brown University. And your most recent book is Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, 2017. Now, of course, in order to be divided, they have to be first united. So what initially united Adams and Jefferson? What drew them together?
Well, the Revolutionary movement, they were, both of them, avid patriots. Jefferson came late to the Continental Congress. He had been ill. He missed the first Continental Congress. He came to the second. And Adams immediately took to him because Jefferson deferred to Adams. And he, of course, Adams was older, but he liked being deferred to. And he took Jefferson under his wing, and they both were eager. They were the most radical, or two of the most radical members of the Continental Congress. So that naturally bound them together.
Yes. And of course, there were various friendships that were formed and then strained, and some even broken during that period. One thinks of not only Adams and Jefferson, but Madison and Hamilton, Washington and Madison to some extent, Washington and George Mason.
Yeah,
Washington and Jefferson.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So what makes the Adams-Jefferson friendship important?
Well, you mean the division or the friendship? The friendship was, of course, important because they united Massachusetts and Virginia in the Continental Congress. But their friendship was really enriched when they were both ministers abroad. When Jefferson joined Adams, who had been abroad several years earlier, and Jefferson at this point was a widower, alone, and the Adams family, Abigail was there with John Quincy, the young John Quincy Adams, and they took Jefferson under their wing, brought him into their family. They went to concerts together, they went to museums together, and he became a member of the family, so to speak. And there was a warm relationship with both Abigail and with John Quincy. Later, Adams said to Jefferson, you were as much a father of John Quincy as I was. So that was really important. That's when the friendship, I think, really deepened.
Would you speak a little bit more about their radicalism, both of them, that they shared during the Revolutionary period?
Well, they were both eager to break from Great Britain, well before most Americans. Jefferson wrote a pamphlet. Actually, it was instructions to his Virginia delegation. He was due to come to the First Continental Congress, became ill, and then wrote out a pamphlet, an essay, which then was published, not with his permission, which became his summary view of the relationship between Britain and her colonies. And it was by far the most radical pamphlet to appear until Thomas Paine's Common Sense. He more or less treated the king as if he were a servant of the people. That's going a little far for the period, and so he was really entering dangerous territory with his rhetoric. But it was by far the most radical pamphlet at that point in the decade-long debate that took place between the mother country and the colonies.
Yes, and as I recall, it was that summary view that convinced Adams that Jefferson wrote 10 times better than any other man in Congress.
That's right. And so Adams, they were both on the committee that was selected to write the Declaration of Independence. Adams was, and it was a committee made up from various sections, from New York and from Virginia and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. But Adams was chairing 24 committees, and especially the Board of War, which was actually fighting fighting at this point, early 1776.
Yes.
And so he said, well, why don't we let this young squirt from Virginia write this pamphlet, this declaration. And he says he's a good man with a pen, and he just thought that was wonderful. Of course, later, 2 decades or later, he was really upset because writing the Declaration became very important, and Jefferson was getting famous for that, and Adams was very jealous, and he said, if I'd known that, I would have written it myself. Right. So that was a source of little jealousy later in their relationship.
And there was a more senior member of that subcommittee too, Roger Sherman of Connecticut.
Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin,
yes, indeed.
And Livingston, I think, from New York. So it was a sectional, 5 people. But Jefferson they edited him a little bit. Adams didn't do much. Franklin made a few suggestions. The Congress then did edit some stuff out, probably as much as 30 or 40%, which Jefferson found excruciating, as any author does, to have
but he was especially tender about his
he
own
was very
productions.
sensitive about having his prose edited. But it turned out to be a magnificent document, and by the 1790s, when the parties arose, the Jeffersonian Republicans opposed to the Federalists, they used that essay, that declaration, on his behalf, and especially all men are created equal. Those phrases suddenly became relevant and politicized, and this is what Jefferson suddenly found, that this declaration, which he had not thought was going to be important, and Adams didn't either. He didn't think that it would be tied to him so personally. Yes. But when he came to realize that it was important, he wrote to his son-in-law and said, look, I want to give you the desk on which I wrote the declaration. He says, it's going to be a relic. Yes. So there was a sense in which the document had taken on a sacred quality, and of course it did. By 1815 or so, it was really, and that's why when Jefferson came to list the 3 accomplishments of his career, the first one was the writing of the Declaration. That would never have been in his mind earlier in his career. So it really became the touchstone of his whole career, I think, and made more famous by, of course, Lincoln several decades later.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about those party politics that you referred to just a moment ago. Jefferson called his unseating of Adams from the presidential chair in 1800 the Revolution of 1800.
Right.
Which must have been a little irksome to Adams, because it implied that Adams had become somehow a counter-revolutionary of sorts. So what was it that Jefferson and the Republicans feared from Adams and his high Federalist colleagues?
They feared the Federalists because they sincerely believed that the Federalist Party, although the Federalists never called themselves a party, were bent on turning the United States into a monarchy. And the Hamiltonian financial program seemed to point in that direction. It was emulating Britain with a bank and a stock market, and the whole financial structure was copied from Great Britain. And Hamilton had that kind of ambition. He wanted to make the United States a fiscal military state, similar to Great Britain, that could take on the European powers on their own terms. Standing army, big navy, the whole all the apparatus of a modern state. Well, this was appalling to Jefferson and Madison and their followers. They had a very different vision of what the United States would be, and they saw the revolution being reversed. And then, of course, the French Revolution intervened, and the Federalists were opposed to that French Revolution, supported England in this gigantic struggle taking place in Europe between the 2 great powers, England and France. And the parties in America divided on that. For the French were supported by the Jeffersonian Republicans. And from the Federalist point of view, it looked as if we had a 5th column movement here in America that was supporting the French Revolution, that was trying to spread its chaos, its terror, to the United States, and there was a threat of a French invasion. This was a very, very serious moment, decade and moment in 1798 in American history. I think as serious a moment as we've had, except for the Civil War. So the parties were really divided, and when Jefferson won in 1800, it was just as if the revolution had been put back on its course, and this monarchical threat was ended. And of course, Adams was deeply humiliated because Washington had had 2 terms, and he just fully expected to have a second term, that it was in the cards. It just had to be. And so it was a deep, bitter humiliation, and he refused to attend Jefferson's inauguration.
Yes. As I recall, as his son refused to
attend Jackson's.
Follow Andrew Jackson's.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. Well, was Adams aware, since we're talking about the French Revolution, was Adams aware, do you know, of some of that more sanguinary language that Jefferson used about, for example, he'd rather see half the earth decimated than see the revolution fail, and it would be better if there were only an Adam and Eve left in every monarchical country? Did he know about that?
He didn't know. Those were private letters that Jefferson wrote. But he knew Jefferson supported the French Revolution. And Adams, of course, had not only opposed the French Revolution, but had said things in print that appalled Jefferson. He said, well, sooner or later, we're going to have to, our elections are going to become so corrupt, so partisan, that we'll have to go to a hereditary Senate and a hereditary president. Those kinds of statements convinced Jefferson that these Federalists were indeed trying to emulate England. But Adams didn't know how much of an ideologue Jefferson was. He knew he was a fervent supporter of the French Revolution, and that really scared him. It's hard for us to recover the feelings that people had about the French Revolution because it was killing thousands of people. And it's probably similar to some of the feelings that people had about Soviet Union in the 1930s and 40s. And the opposition to the Soviet Union, or if you were a true believer, then you were a supporter. And that's the kind of feeling people had back in the 90s about the French Revolution.
And I think, like the Cold War era, religion played a bit of a part in some of the party struggles as well. For instance, the High Federalists are accusing Jefferson of being an atheist.
Right.
I think there are credible reports of New England farm wives, Federalists, burying the family Bible out back for fear that Jefferson's minions will come and have public burnings of the scriptures.
Jefferson, of course, had made, they didn't know how anti-religious he actually was. Yes. He had made 2 statements publicly. One was in his Notes on Virginia, where I think he said, if I remember correctly, he said, well, what does it matter if you believe in one God or 20 gods? Yes. It doesn't break my arm.
Pick my pocket or break my leg.
Break my leg, that's right.
Yes.
Okay, and then he, his Bill for Religious Freedom, which was passed by the state legislature of Virginia in 1786, one of the great documents of American history, but his preamble was really quite extraordinary, where he says, well, our religious opinions, not even faith, just opinions, are no more important to civic life than our opinions of physics or geometry. Well, that's not something most Americans believed. That was way out of line with current American opinions. That came back to haunt him. He wasn't an atheist. It's hard to find any atheists in the 18th century. Yes. Certainly Thomas Paine wasn't an atheist, but they were really quite dismissive of Christianity. And Jefferson said things privately that would have really been appalling, like, the hocus pocus of the Trinity and a whole host of statements about how ridiculous Christianity was. But Adams didn't know about that, unless he heard them in private conversation. He didn't know about these letters that Jefferson would write.
Neither man was a Christian. I recall John Adams writing about the blasphemy of the Incarnation.
Well, they were Unitarians, is right. Unitarianism wasn't a full denomination yet, but there was Unitarian beliefs. That is to say, they doubted the divinity of Christ,
Yes.
but they respected Jesus, and Adams was far more respectful of religion than Jefferson. Jefferson really mocked it all the time, in private conversations. Adams never, even though he was not he did not believe in the divinity of Jesus. That was quite common among elites. He certainly was respectful of religion. There's a difference between Jefferson and Adams on that.
Yes, and do you think that's a legacy of his Puritan forebears? Or?
It's partly that, maybe just temperament. He was somebody who, he believed in hereafter, and Jefferson seems to have believed. It's hard to sort of reconcile all that but Adams certainly believed in hereafter. In fact, he made an extraordinary statement once. If there were no hereafter, then we all should take opium. In other words, life isn't worth living unless there's a hereafter. That might have been a moment of depression when he said that statement, but still, it's an extraordinary statement.
Yes. And you mentioned that bill for establishing religious freedom in
Yes.
Virginia, which Jefferson did put on that obelisk, his epitaph.
Right. One of the three achievements that he had made. The third being establishing the University of Virginia.
Yes. And curious that two-term presidency doesn't appear on that list.
That's right. Well, his presidency was mixed. The second term was rather awkward with the embargo and so on. Mm-hmm. But that's true. But the three were ones that it would be a good question to ask him. Why not the presidency?
Well, let's follow on that. We know, because Jefferson wrote his own epitaph, what those three achievements were, of which he was most proud. What do you think Adams would say if we asked him a similar question?
He had several statements. One, I think, the one he talked about towards the end, of course, was sending the delegation to France in 1800 to end the Quasi-War. He said that was one of my most disinterested, if not the most disinterested, and important actions of my life, and it was. But of course, it didn't help him because although he ended the war and it was a great achievement, results of this didn't come back until after he had lost the election of 1800. I think if it had been done a little earlier, he might have survived, because people would have seen his peace efforts as successful. But that, and I think the other one was the defense of the soldiers in the Boston Massacre, which was a courageous action in his mind, and took on more importance than it had at the time, because it isn't quite as courageous as he makes it out to be, because he's asked, he and Quincy, Josiah Quincy, are the two leading attorneys in Boston at the time, and so the Patriots, Samuel Adams et al., came to Adams and Quincy and said, will you two guys defend these soldiers, because the Patriots are a little alarmed about the reputation of Boston in the empire in the aftermath of the massacre, and sort of like feelings people had about Dallas after Kennedy's assassination. And so they wanted a good defense of the soldiers. And so it isn't quite, taking on, it isn't quite as courageous as Adams made it out to be. But he was aware that he had hurt himself, although it never hurt his practice. I mean, he and Quincy both continued to make lots of money after that. But he was asked, I think in 73 or 74, would you like to give the Massacre Day oration? And Adams said, oh, that'd be too much. He said, if I get up and try to, celebrate the Massacre Day after having defended the soldiers, I think it'd be too embarrassing. So he excused himself from that. So he realized that he had probably rustled a few feathers, because not everyone knew that he had been put up to this defense by the Patriot leadership in the city.
What do you think about the Massachusetts Constitution of 1779 and 80 that Adams wrote almost single-handedly?
Right. He's by far the most important constitution erected by the states. It came late, and that was an advantage for Massachusetts. And it influenced, I think it's important because it influenced the structure of the federal government. Adams set forth a strong governor, independent. Although he's only annually elected, he is given appointment powers, patronage powers, that the other governors did not have, the ones created in 1776. And most important, he's given a veto. Adams wanted a complete, unqualified veto, but the convention overrode that and gave him a limited veto, which of course was followed by the convention of 1787 in Philadelphia, giving the president a limited veto. So but the structure is similar: a Senate and a strong Senate, a House of Representatives, and a governor, an executive. Also, a strong independent judiciary, which again was influential. This is, I think, for that reason, it becomes the most important constitution. In fact, many people thought it was the ultimate constitution. What undid it a little bit, tarnished it, was, of course, Shays' Rebellion. 5 or 6 years later, that suggested that if Massachusetts couldn't hold back the plebs, the plebeians, and the populace, then we needed a new, strong federal government. The federal government is a consequence of doubts about the democracy in the states.
Yes. And as I recall, Adams referred to that Constitution, of which he was justly proud, as having a most mild and equitable establishment of religion. He had a little bit of religion in there that I think would have stuck in Jefferson's craw down in Virginia.
Well, Adams later denied that was he didn't write that section, he says. So, because he became a little embarrassed by it. He thought that was a little too strong, because it was a strong, continued the congregational establishment when other states were doing away with their establishment. And Massachusetts went on to have the longest lasting established church, 1833. Yes. And that meant, tax-supported ministers, and your taxes were going, unless you could beg off, and there were ways of getting out of it, but it was awkward to do that, and it was difficult. You had to have a legitimate alternative. And so this became a little embarrassing to him, and he tried to say, well, I didn't write that section. I think it was Article 3 or whatever. He always tried to dismiss that. But it certainly, he was more sympathetic to to religion than, as I say, than Jefferson.
Well, they have a falling out, and it's precipitous. And but by about 1812, as I recall, Benjamin Rush, Dr. Benjamin Rush,
a physician,
kind of a matchmaker,
a mutual friend, but much more friendly with Adams. He worked 2 years to bring these two patriots together. He felt it was just, as he said, each of you represents the sections, the North and the South, and we need to reconcile you. And he worked at this for really 2 years, and he did it so nicely, because he would tell each of them, well, the other one says he loves you, and then he'd go back and say and finally Adams says to him, okay, I'll write Mr. Jefferson, and he did. And then he makes a little comment, I'm sending you a little piece of manufacturing from the state of Massachusetts. And Jefferson, being straight thinker with very little sense of humor, took this literally and went on to respond with a long essay on manufacturing in Virginia, when in fact Adams was sending him copies of his son's orations that had just been published, the Harvard orations on rhetoric that he had just published. And so that they then resumed their correspondence, and it went on for the rest of their lives till 1826, with Adams writing really twice as many letters as Jefferson. In fact, at one point he realized that, and he apologized for that, and Jefferson said, oh, don't, your letters are wonderful, and so on. And so Adams says, well, maybe you've got more correspondence than I have. How many letters did you receive last year, he said. And this was 1820. Jefferson responds, 1,200 and something. And Adams is appalled. He says, ooh, I only had 120 something, a tenth. See, Jefferson is already an international superstar. He's corresponding with the Tsar of Russia and with the great German naturalist. I mean, he's corresponding with people all over the world, part of the enlightened world. Adams is not in that league. They're in two different leagues, and Adams realizes that and accepts it. I think he's jealous. He's a very vain person, but he understood somehow that Jefferson represented the enlightened era in a way that he didn't. But it is startling to him to find out that he only has a tenth of the correspondence and Jefferson tried to answer everybody. So he spent a lot of his life, the retirement years, answering letters. And
the cast of their minds is different.
Oh, yes.
Jefferson has a much more wide-ranging mind, I suppose we might say.
Right.
A real American Renaissance man. Adams may be a little more practical politically, maybe more of a constitutional thinker. Jefferson a little more of an aspirational thinker.
Yes, I think Adams's letters are more interesting to read, though. I find it, at least. I mean, he's pungent. He's much better than his formal writings when he wrote the defense of the constitutions of the United States. It's so turgid. It's so heavy. But when he writes his letters or his diary, he has this incredible, vivid picture of people and images and the metaphors that Jefferson couldn't match. I just think his letters are far more interesting in that respect. Now, he doesn't have the range, but there's no pretension. He knows far more about history than Jefferson. But there's no doubt that Jefferson knew. Jefferson was the kind of guy that wanted to know about everything. And he did. There's nobody who knows more about more things in North America than Jefferson. And I would include Franklin in that. I just think Jefferson is incredibly widely read. And he was proud of that. And he saw himself as a kind of impresario, bringing Western culture, the great books and the great art, back to his benighted countrymen who were, stuck in the sticks in North America.
And that home of his, Monticello, is a virtual museum, especially the foyer as you enter.
Right, but designed for a bachelor. I mean, he makes no concessions to his guests. If you go there, you're trying to go to upstairs. You have this narrow little stairway. I mean, unlike the other Virginia homes, there's nothing grand about the stairway. It's a very self-indulgent building, but it's a marvelous building, a World Heritage Site. Of course, Jefferson's status is declining in these days because of his slaveholding, and that was the one issue that they didn't talk much about. They do bring it up over the Missouri crisis, but Adams realized, he was sensitive to this. He knew that he couldn't just, he himself would say, I never owned a slave in my life and I don't like the institution. But he said to Jefferson and other Southerners, look, you've got this problem. I'm not going to speak to you outside and tell you what you should do. You're going to have to work it out for yourselves. But they both were, after the Missouri crisis, both frightened by the institution of slavery. They knew that would be the issue that would break the Union. If the Union were to be broken, it would be broken over slavery.
And that's the famous fire bell in the night to
right.
Jefferson.
Well, Jefferson really is scared of that Missouri crisis because he realizes that the North really cares about abolishing slavery and interfering with the Southern. He becomes quite defensive. And unfortunately, his last letters read like a Southern fire eater defending his section against these Northern busybodies. It's not a happy period of his life.
maybe with the possible exception of that letter very, very late in his life, having to decline coming up to celebrate the 4th of July. But
that was a wonderful letter, and of course, he's aware. I think at moments like that, he's aware that his letters, of course, are going to be part of his legacy. Sometimes he forgets about that, but I think in that particular case he does. And he quotes some, without quotation marks, quotes some 17th century English radical.
Richard Rumbold, I
think.
Well, his gallows speech.
That's right. And, mankind is not destined to be booted and spurred and so on. He has a vision of the future that makes him the spokesman for the American Enlightenment, because he sees the democracy is spreading. Every country, he thinks, will eventually become free. Not overnight. It may take a long time, but he does have that vision, which I think liberals from that moment on have had that dream. And I think that's why he's celebrated, for that vision he had. And then, of course, for the Declaration, which Lincoln, all honor to Jefferson, because he uses that. He uses the Declaration, particularly the all men are created equal, to wage rhetorical war on the South and to mobilize his northern countrymen through that bloody conflict. This is what it's about, and we have a vision of what the United States ought to be and what the future will be, and we're the last best hope. We can't let this fail. So he's using Jefferson to, and really I think he really rescues Jefferson, because I think by the eve of the Revolution, eve of the Civil War, the founders weren't all that important. I think the founders get rediscovered with Lincoln, and a bright Princeton historian, Frank Craven, wrote a book on this point, saying that the founding fathers through the antebellum period are William Bradford, John Smith, William Penn. Not the founding fathers. It's Lincoln and then this post-Civil War period that really rescues them and makes them the founding fathers, and we sort of forget all about those original founders of the 17th century.
Lincoln and maybe Frederick Douglass, who says that the framers of the Constitution wrote a glorious liberty document, and so maybe brings our minds back to that a little bit.
Yes.
Well, after that remarkable letter of Jefferson's, he dies shortly thereafter, and remarkably, Adams and Jefferson die on the same day.
That's right. Of course, they didn't know that, but in fact, Adams says, as his last phrase, I think, Jefferson still survives. That's apparently what he said. Of course, that wasn't true, because Jefferson had died 5 hours earlier. But in a kind of figurative sense, he does. He survives in a way that Adams didn't. Adams has recovered a little bit, but there's no way that you can make Adams and Jefferson equals, except for those of us who know the details. Then we have our real affection for Adams. But relative to the world, I mean, if you look at Adams's home in Quincy, Massachusetts, it's run by the National Park Service. I think they close it in the winter off season. I mean, and so it has very few visitors, relatively few visitors compared to Monticello, which has 500,000 visitors a year from all over the world to this World Heritage Site. And of course, Jefferson has a huge memorial in Washington, right off the mall there. There's nothing for Adams. I think one of the libraries now there's an Adams building for the Library of Congress, but it's not the same. There's no memorial for Adams. So the two really are remembered very differently, I think, by Americans.
Well, Professor Wood, it's been a delight. Thank you very much for your thoughts.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a joy to have you here.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.